Has Donald Trump finally gone too far for Republicans? Because what's happening right now is raising serious questions, not just from critics, but from inside his own party. Before we dive into the full story, comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Earlier this week, concerns were growing that Trump was allegedly trying to set up what critics describe as a kind of political slush fund, a system that could potentially benefit allies who claim they were unfairly targeted under the previous administration. Now, whether supporters see it as justice or critics see it as favoritism, one thing is becoming clear: Republicans are starting to get uncomfortable. Because once politics starts looking personal, even loyal allies begin asking difficult questions. And for some in the GOP, this may be the moment they start wondering, has Trump finally pushed things too far?
Well, that's exactly what he's doing. But now, James, he is facing monumental pushback from Republicans on Capitol Hill, who are enraged about what many here are describing, many analysts are describing, as the most naked effort to engage in corrupt practices by any president in American history. And yesterday, when the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, went to Capitol Hill for lunch with Republicans, he found himself on the receiving end of huge pushback from more than 25 Republicans up on Capitol Hill, telling him that this idea that Donald Trump has forced Todd Blanche to implement. And remember, this is what happens when the traditional but not constitutionally guaranteed independence of the Department of Justice is completely eviscerated by an American president who has turned the Department of Justice now not only into his personal office of retribution, but also into an ATM, a cash machine, potentially for his mates. If we just spin back, you will remember that Donald Trump's businesses and his tax returns were being audited by the IRS, the American equivalent of HMRC. Some of those tax returns leaked to the American public. Donald Trump, as president, sued his own government for $10 billion, sued the government over the leaking of those tax returns. The case ran into all sorts of difficulty in court. It was then that the Trump administration said to Todd Blanche, OK, we're going to pull this lawsuit, but in exchange, we want this slush fund created. $1.776 billion, 1776, it's the 250th anniversary of American independence, that is going to be made available to people who claim that Joe Biden unleashed weaponized lawfare against them. In other words, politically motivated prosecutions. Now, the Trump family would not be eligible for that cash. We were told initially that all they were getting as out of this whole arrangement was an apology over the leaking of some of the tax returns. In fact, 24 hours later, we also learned that what the Trump family, the president himself, and the Trump organization was receiving was complete immunity, an agreement by the IRS that it would not pursue any claims on past tax returns. I mean, that had the potential to save the Trumps about $100 million in possible penalties that they might have been looking at as a result of IRS enforcement.
And then comes the question that really cuts through all the noise. If everything was completely above board, then why put protections like this in place at all? Because let's be honest, that's the part raising eyebrows. Critics are looking at this and asking a pretty simple question. If there was nothing to worry about, why the need for what looks like political insulation? Now, supporters will say this is Trump fighting back against unfair treatment, but opponents see something very different. To them, this starts looking less like accountability and more like damage control. And once Republicans start having to answer those questions publicly, that's when the political pressure really begins to build.
Well, I mean, precisely. And, we don't know if the audit was still ongoing. Jeez. I mean, certainly a couple of years ago, one of Donald Trump's sons indicated that it was. Yeah. But then this idea also to set up this fund that anybody who can claim they were victimized and weaponized by the Biden administration could go after the cash raised huge questions about whether that meant the January the 6th insurrectionists would be eligible for the cash. Clearly they would be, including some January the 6th insurrectionists who have since been convicted of other crimes and returned to jail, including one particular case of a January 6th insurrectionist later arrested on child molestation charges. So members of Congress were sort of asking in open hearings the acting Attorney General, would that figure be eligible for some of this cash? And he absolutely sidestepped the question. So the Trump administration now has found that every camel's back has a straw that breaks it.
Why?
And
Why
in the
now?
case of this weaponization fund, it's the Republicans that are demonstrating some spine and turning around to Trump and saying, we're not doing this.
But here's the question that really changes everything. Why are Republicans suddenly pushing back now? Because, let's be honest, many critics are asking the same thing. Trump has faced controversy after controversy over the years, and yet much of the Republican Party stayed firmly behind him. So what suddenly changed? Well, some are arguing that this isn't necessarily about this being the worst controversy. In fact, many would say it isn't. The real issue may be something much more political: timing, pressure, and survival. Because when headlines become harder to defend, voter frustration starts growing and elections get closer. Loyalty suddenly becomes a lot more complicated. And for some Republicans, this may be less about standing up to Trump and more about protecting themselves.
No, I mean, it's up there.
Yes,
it's certainly up there with many of the worst things that he's done. But the answer to your question is because they are angry with him. They are angry over the way in which he has purged the party, effectively, of some of their friends. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana last week, thrown out by Republican voters in Louisiana as the in a primary contest as the result of Donald Trump's intervention. They're furious about what the president is doing down in Texas, endorsing a scandal-ridden, impeached former Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, in many ways the Donald Trump of Texas, endorsing him over their friend, the incumbent Senator John Cornyn. And they're also terrified for their own skins. They're about to go home for the Memorial Day weekend. They are going to face so much anger from their constituents in their home states, as we also wait to see whether the price of petrol here is going to tick up on average above $5.02 a gallon, the high point that it hit in Joe Biden's presidency. There's every indication that that's going to take place. Bond markets are soaring, credit's getting harder to find here. I can tell you here in Washington, D.C., the property market is at a complete standstill. The Fed is going to have its hands tied again by economic circumstances and won't be able to do Donald Trump's bidding in terms of dropping interest rates. So those lawmakers are terrified for their own futures as they prepare to face voters in November and realize how many of these president's policies, including this sort of naked act at corruption, is just resulting in enormous pushback from the country.
And this is where the political calculation starts getting really awkward for Republicans. Because some critics are now arguing that whenever pressure starts building around Trump, attention somehow shifts somewhere else, a new headline, a new controversy, a new political firestorm. Whether you agree with that or not, it's a perception that's clearly gaining traction. But here's the bigger point that could really worry Republicans. Trump's endorsement still carries enormous power inside the GOP. If you want to win a Republican primary, having Trump in your corner can still feel almost essential. The problem? Winning the nomination and winning the actual election are two very different things. Because while Trump's backing may energize loyal Republican voters, some analysts argue it can become much harder for candidates when they're facing a Democrat in a general election. In other words, the Trump stamp might help you survive the Republican fight, but could make the bigger battle even tougher. And if Republicans are starting to believe that, then suddenly this isn't just about loyalty anymore. It becomes a question of political survival.